This tutorial is all about the materials used in car making. Let's start with car bodies. These four pictures I've chosen because they have different materials used for their car bodies. Top left we have the DeLorean, as in Back to the Future films, and this was unusual because it had a stainless steel body, therefore it didn't have to be painted at all. On the top right we have the Reliant Robin, and this car had a bodywork made of glass reinforced plastic. Bottom left we have the Audi A8, which has a bodywork made of aluminium, and bottom right we have the Peugeot, I think 207, which has mainly got a steel bodywork but has some panels, like the front panels, are made of plastic. So why are car bodies made of these different materials? It's all to do with the properties of each of the materials, and we're going to focus particularly on iron and aluminium and the differences in properties between them, and why there are advantages and disadvantages for making car bodies out of aluminium or from steel, which is the alloy of iron. When we compare the properties of iron against aluminium, some are different and some are the same. Iron, for example, corrodes a great deal, whereas aluminium doesn't corrode. Iron is more dense, whereas aluminium is less dense, less heavy for its size. Iron is magnetic, aluminium is non-magnetic. They're both electrical conductors and they are both malleable, which means that they can be hammered into shape. Aluminium, being less dense than steel, has the advantage of making the car body lighter, so such a car would have a better fuel economy. Its bodywork would corrode less because aluminium corrodes less than steel, so it would have a longer lifetime. It can be recycled just as a steel car can. So why aren't more cars made of aluminium? Well, steel is considerably cheaper, so it's much more affordable. Although the steel body does corrode more quickly, it can be protected from corrosion. Kia cars, for example, which are made out of steel, have got 7-year anti-corrosion warranties because they're so well protected with paint and by galvanizing. Although steel is heavier and therefore has poorer fuel economy, it's much cheaper than the same bodywork made out of aluminium. So aluminium only tends to be used for high-powered or high-performance cars, or ones where expense, the cost of the car, isn't really the most important thing for the buyer. Here's an exam question. Pam investigates the properties of iron and aluminium. Look at the table, it shows her results. And we need to complete the table. Malleability. For iron, it would also bend easily. For aluminium, the ease of corrosion would be that it doesn't rust or doesn't corrode, to use the proper term, because it's only really iron and steel that rust, other metals corrode. And the electrical conduction of aluminium is also good. Here are the answers to those questions and what other answers are allowed. An exam question may have a table of different materials used in making a car with their properties and ask you to decide why particular materials are used for particular jobs. Here's a typical car with some of the materials used for it. The tyres, they would be made out of rubber because rubber is flexible and has a certain amount of elasticity so that it can be blown up. The seats, the covers tend to be made out of fabric or out of leather because it's flexible. The bodywork is out of steel or aluminium because it's malleable and won't rust too much. The windscreen is made out of glass because the glass is transparent. It's also unreactive with water. The wiring is made out of copper. Copper is a very good conductor of electricity and it's also flexible. And the engine block tends to be made out of aluminium because it's got a low density and therefore keeps the weight of the car down. So, matching those properties to the uses in the car, the steel is made into the bodywork of most cars, and the reason is that it's malleable. The copper is used for wiring. That's because it's a good electrical conductor. The aluminium is made into the engine block because of its low density. The glass is made into the windscreen because it's colourless. Plastics are used for the dashboard because they can be moulded and they've got a low density, and fibres are used for the car seats because they are flexible. Here's an exam question. Iron rusts. Complete the sentence about rusting. Iron needs water and oxygen from the air to rust. Copper is another metal. It's used to make electrical wires because it's a good conductor of electricity. It's just another reason why copper is used to make electrical wires. It is flexible, so the wires can be bent. As you can see, they would accept either oxygen or air as one of the two things which are needed for rusting, and there are various other words you could use instead of flexible, or various other properties you can use for the copper. Now, cars are very expensive things and are made out of all kinds of different materials. It's important that cars are able to be recycled, and you need to know a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of recycling the materials used in cars, and also about new European laws which specify a minimum percentage of materials used which must be recyclable. When we look at the typical composition of a modern motor car, we can see that the majority of the car, assuming that it's got a steel bodywork, is ferrous metal, which means iron and steel. But there are a variety of other materials that the car is made from, so you can only imagine how difficult it would be to dismantle a car again and to be able to recycle each of those materials. The onus is being gradually pushed towards the manufacturer for the recycling of the car at the end of its useful life. And for this reason, and to stop cars from being dumped, the European End-of-Life Vehicles Directive has come into being. This says that a large proportion of the car must be recyclable. In fact, by 2015, 95% of a car must be recyclable. This has encouraged manufacturers to be more responsible about the number of different materials they use in their cars, how well each of these materials are labelled, and how easy they are to be dismantled. It also discourages the manufacturers from using toxic materials because they are going to be the ones who are responsible for dismantling the car at the end of its life. Of course, we should want to recycle car parts at the end of the car's useful life. It will save natural resources. So if the plastic bumpers, for example, can be melted down and made into new bumpers, it means that crude oil does not need to be made into new plastic. It also removes the problem of how to dispose of the car, and it stops idle people dumping them on street corners. It saves the owner also from paying scrappage costs because there is a value in the old car once it's come to the end of its useful life. It also forces the manufacturers to consider recycling at the design stage so they don't use toxic materials. The difficulties, though, of recycling car parts is that it's unlikely any of those parts can be reused, so they'll have to be broken down into smaller parts, melted down and made into new parts. Also, each of those different materials needs separating from each other, and therefore they need to be well marked and easy to dismantle. We've looked at iron and we've looked at steel, and sometimes the two words are interchangeable, particularly when we talk about them being metals that corrode. However, there is a difference because iron is a pure metal, whereas steel is an alloy of iron with a small amount of carbon in it. When iron is made in a blast furnace, the iron that comes out of the furnace is called cast iron. This is quite brittle, and it's really only used for things like drains and manhole covers and maybe solid fuel burners in houses. If it's hammered into shape by, for example, a blacksmith, we call this wrought iron, and wrought iron is much stronger. It's used for gates and fences. Cast iron, you see, has a lot of carbon in it, and it's not pure, and it makes it very brittle. However, if you take all of the carbon out of the iron, the pure iron becomes too soft for most uses. So most iron is made into steel, which still contains a small amount of carbon, but may have other metals added as well for strength. For example, vanadium and manganese in the steel which is used for tools like spanners. And stainless steel has a great deal of chromium added to it to stop it from corroding. But generally speaking, steel is more useful than iron because it's harder, it's stronger, and it corrodes less than iron does. Here's another exam question. This is about the properties of metals. It lists the data for the properties of some of the metals: aluminium, copper, iron, tin and zinc, their density, which is how heavy they are, for their size, their relative strength and their relative electrical conductivity. It says write down the name of the metal with the highest electrical conductivity. Here's an easy question then. All we need to do is look at this column and find out which one has the highest number. Here it's the copper, so we'd write down copper. Some of the properties of aluminium and iron are different. Write down two ways in which they're different. You can use the data in the table to help you. Well, if we look back at the table, we can see that aluminium is less dense than iron, and also aluminium is a better electrical conductor than iron. Copper and zinc make the alloy brass. Write down one use of brass. Well, one thing it's used for is door knockers. It's also used for hinges. Of course, you'd only write down one answer because it's asked for one answer only, but there's a couple of examples. As you can see, there are various answers for the properties which are different for iron and aluminium, and there are also lots and lots of different uses of brass. Any sensible answer would be acceptable.